We're so excited to have you both on today to discuss the hot topic of metabolic health, weight loss, and the growing popularity of the GLP-1 class drugs. We both loved your conversations that we had with you previously, and it's fun to do this joint episode today as part of a kind of like a mini series that we're going to have covering this topic. And not everything we read about and hear in the media about these drugs is 100% true. And so today we want to provide our listeners with an overview of what these drugs are and debunk some of the myths and really lay out the pros and cons for people who are potentially looking to reduce their chronic disease and fight obesity through taking one of these. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So before we dive into the interview, we'd love for you to share what's kind of filling you up right now or bringing you the most joy in your life. And either of you can chime in and go first.
Oh my gosh. I'm in such a good place in my life right now. I would say, I don't know if this is circular or redundant or something, but my baseline level of joy is so nourishing. I think I'm just kind of coming through perimenopause, and I got on a beautiful cocktail of bioidentical estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone recently that just smoothed everything out. And I read a great book called The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. And I'm almost 50. I'll be 50 in just a couple months. And my 40s were hard. They were filled with professional success, but also just really hard years for me personally. And I can feel all that lifting. Like the book talked about all these psychological trends that happen through the 40s. And I just feel it all lifting. And so I've got 3 kids. I'm a mom of teenagers, and I love raising teenagers. It's so much better than raising little kids.
I
for
agree.
me personally. So yeah, and my marriage is feeling really thriving and flourishing. So I'm just a big check across the board, feeling very fulfilled by just about everything in my life. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. And I want to get that book because Marnie and I'm actually approaching 50 in a few weeks, and she is recently 50. And so this is probably good for our friends and people that we spend a lot of time with. So thank you. What about you, Lauren?
Amazing. I was going to say, it sounds like some happy birthdays are in order for the entire group. I'm actually at a great moment in my life as well. On the topic of books, I've been putting more effort into growing my understanding of spirituality and how that filters into my work, my relationships, just life in general. And so I've been reading this book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Fear. And it's really changed my perspective in many ways on kind of the day-to-day moments and how I approach the things that would have otherwise created anxiety, I think. And I've just felt a lot of flexibility from that, even into kind of my intellectual pursuits, the consulting projects I'm doing, my intentions with how to kind of serve as much as possible from a health perspective for our collective communities. So feeling really grateful about that. And also just at a moment in my life where there's less in my life is dictated by the shoulds and more just by the life that I actually want to create for myself. So that's the moment I'm in, and I'm very grateful.
And you're with 3 older women right now, right? And you're clearly younger than all of us. And so the fact that you're figuring this out now is amazing, right? Took me a long time. So
well, I should say it's a work in progress. I'm definitely not all the way there, but I see what's possible for me. And so and interestingly, I've actually been kind of going on this pathway a little bit with my mom as well, who's exploring similar things. So it's been an intergenerational exploration as well, which has been really special.
That's awesome. Well, before we dive into, this topic and the GLP-1 class drugs, we thought it would be helpful for everyone to understand why focusing on metabolic health is so critical, and why, the obesity crisis is having such a big impact on Americans, right? And people around the world. And Lauren, we thought maybe you could kick that off.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I was previously at Levels, which is a venture-backed company focused on reversing the metabolic health crisis. So this is an area that I'm very passionate about. I think there's been so much conversation about weight and weight loss, but this is really just one piece of a much bigger picture, which is the metabolic health crisis more broadly. About 93% of Americans, so almost all of us, have some marker of metabolic dysfunction. As we know, 70% of Americans meet the BMI criteria for overweight or obese. 120 million Americans approximately are living with prediabetes or diabetes. But this is all taking place within a much bigger context. And that is in large part a very toxic food environment. So on average, Americans are eating 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods, 70% of those calories for children, over 20 teaspoons a day of added sugar, 30 teaspoons for children. And these are foods that are created on purpose, stripped of fiber, stripped of protein, stripped of nutrition to be addictive. And so I think as we think about what is the solution for the metabolic health crisis, for weight, for all of these different aspects of health, it's really important to zoom out and think about what the actual underlying problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that broad brushstrokes lay of the land. It's horrifying, and it's all true. It's happening around us. We're not paying any attention to it. And I am an addiction expert, and so the consequences of the addictiveness of our food supply are enormous. And you just laid a lot of them out. And I think this is where a conversation of GLP-1 drugs is really helpful and interesting, because they do suppress addiction in the mesolimbic reward pathway. So, my background is as a professor of brain and cognitive sciences, and it's really interesting what these drugs do to the brain. People talk a lot about their appetite suppressant effects, but they also have addiction suppression effects. And it's the double whammy of that people are so grateful for when they get on these drugs, of like, oh, I'm just not craving. I'm just not thinking about needing, wanting, yearning. It's almost, people say, it's given me the brain of a skinny person, like they imagine like, oh, there's certain people who just don't go through their day thinking about food all the time, which there are, because addiction isn't a thing for everyone. When people glibly say, oh, everyone's addicted to something, it's not true. A third of brains are just not vulnerable to addiction at all. And a third of people are moderately susceptible, and a third of people are heavily susceptible. And so as we look at this metabolic health crisis, addiction is a huge driver. Like, people can drink alcohol, and not everyone starts drinking heavily or becomes alcoholic, right? And then, a lot of people with alcohol in the food supply, like 40% of people, just decide not to drink ever, amazing. And so the consequences of our current food environment are so interesting, right? Because you really do have to go out of your way these days to not be eating ultra-processed foods. You have to be very particular and careful, and be kind of like a salmon swimming upstream against the flow of what's happening around you. You have to like really go out of your way to pick and choose your food and not eat what's available or convenient at any given moment. So metabolic health is not easy to maintain in our society. And so people need to be making choices. And, it's interesting. I hate to raise the personal responsibility thing, because I just learned recently that actually is a perspective and even a phrase that was brought to the forefront by the smoking industry, the cigarette industry. Even the term personal responsibility didn't even exist in public discourse until the 1960s, when the cigarette companies were trying to convince us all that was the way to think about it, that we wanted everything to be available and for it to be just based on personal responsibility. And the reality is that doesn't work for most people. It doesn't work for teenage pregnancy. It didn't work for cigarettes. It's not until you start to handle things at a societal level that you start to be able to see trends, move significantly in this direction or that direction. And we've done nothing about it. So our food trends have just gone terribly in the wrong direction. And so the obesity pandemic is the natural consequence of that. But as you say, it's not just an obesity pandemic, it's a metabolic health crisis.
Yeah,
Right.
it's also interesting because there's been a lot of conversation around genetics, and less that I've heard around epigenetics, which is to say genetics being the DNA blueprint that we're born with, and epigenetics being the impact of the environment and how those genes are expressed or manifest. And, you know, if you think about it from a genetics perspective, in general, it takes hundreds to thousands of evolutionary generations to result in a meaningful genetic change. So we're talking 5,000, 50,000 years. 100 years ago, obesity was relatively rare. And so when we think about how we got to where we are today, it seems unlikely that it was genes and much more likely that it's environment, right? When we zoom out. And I think it's everything you said, Susan. I mean, we're essentially set up for failure. And even more than that, there's so many layers of this. Like there are so many times when I'm out with friends I love, and it's actually difficult to order a healthy meal from the menu simply because of social pressure and normalization around behaviors that are really built into so many things: custom, tradition, emotion, love, right? All these things that are really difficult to unravel.
Yeah.
It's
And
so true. And I just, you know, and then you hear about these drugs, right? These GLP class 1 drugs. And that's why everyone thinks, oh my God, this is amazing because, you know, you can supposedly eat what you want, but you're not very hungry. So you're not dealing with all these cravings, and you're not, maybe the emotions that are typically tied to food aren't there anymore. And you're really just eating to feed your body because you have to, and not because you feel like you just want to eat all this food.
Well, that's a really interesting point because we need to take note. People on these drugs are not eating more healthfully. They're just eating less.
Right. And
they're
they
eating a
almost
little
think
more
it's
healthfully.
a ticket to eat whatever they want because
Well,
they're
yeah.
not that hungry.
They're eating a little more healthfully because their brains are less attracted to the ultra rewarding foods. But I'm, as a weight loss expert, and I just help people lose weight, you know, 24/7 in my life. That's what I'm doing, helping people lose weight. You have to eat less food and be so mindful of the nutrient composition of that food to get enough nutrients as you're losing weight, to get enough protein, to get enough basic nutrients, that I'm kind of horrified at the thought of just eating less of what people are eating now, because how on earth are you going to meet your basic needs on that kind of diet?
Well, that's exactly it. And then it gets to the metabolic health, because we all know, like, the term skinny fat, just because you are a ideal size based on society doesn't mean that you're healthy on the inside. Because I've heard people say, well, now I go to Chick-fil-A and order the kids menu.
Right. I mean,
that's reality. That's happening.
Right.
And so maybe before we dive, I mean, we could have a whole discussion just on, you know, what we've shared in a few minutes, and we will link up a couple episodes, because even Lauren, your episode, and Susan's, and we had one with Kelly Means, kind of talks more about this. But can we just give our listeners a high-level overview of what the GLP-1 class drugs are? They probably heard their street names: Ozempic, Wegovy, et cetera. How they work and why they're gaining in popularity right now.
Yeah, sure. I can do that. So basically, there's 2 main drug companies that are making these drugs. There's Novo Nordisk, which is a Danish company that has taken a drug called semaglutide and patented it. And they're selling it for diabetics under the brand name Ozempic, and for people with obesity or excess body weight under the brand name Wegovy. So those are the super famous ones, right? But Eli Lilly has come out with a class of drugs as well that are called tirzepatides. And you've got Zepbound and Mounjaro. So again, kind of a pair of drugs, one for weight issues and one for diabetes. And the difference is that semaglutide is a GLP-1 agonist only. So agonist means like mimicker, like it's basically pretending in the body to be GLP-1. It's not exactly molecularly GLP-1, but it binds to those receptors. What GLP-1 does is a few things. It slows down digestion. So it's making you feel fuller longer. It's also moderating blood sugar by increasing insulin from the pancreas and decreasing glucagon from the liver. So that's balancing out blood sugar. This is how it helps with diabetes. And then it's also going into the mesolimbic reward pathway, and it's dampening the dopamine response and also kind of moderating the dopamine response there. There's about 100 studies in rodents and humans showing the work that it does in the addiction centers of the brain. And so people are reporting that they're smoking fewer cigarettes, they're drinking less alcohol, they're just not as interested in cookies. It's sort of providing some benefit there. So that's semaglutide. The tirzepatide is not just a GLP-1 agonist, it's also a GIP agonist, and it just gives a little bit of double duty. So the tirzepatides actually are resulting in slightly stronger weight loss, and they're a little bit less expensive. So I expect to see a turning of the tide in the consumer population where people are probably going to start to prefer the tirzepatide drugs. And the main side effects people experience are gastrointestinal in nature, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, belching, at the extreme stomach blockage, like a complete intestinal shutdown, which does not reverse when you stop the drugs. So it's not that common, but it's super dangerous.
But do the gastro issues stop when you stop the drugs?
Yes.
Okay.
But the intestinal blockage does not stop. So if you get gastroparesis, it just shuts down your digestive system, and that's not a good thing. There's lawsuits starting around that. People are saying that they weren't adequately informed of that side effect or the potential for that side effect. You can just Google that one, hop on one of those class action lawsuits if you want to. Yeah. And then there's other side effects that are talked about, like muscle loss, which turns out to be false by my reading of the literature. I've found several studies that directly contradict that. Whenever you lose weight, unless you're doing really strong resistance training, you lose some muscle and some fat. The studies I've found have actually shown that GLP-1s are protective against muscle loss during weight loss. So I don't know where that rumor started. I don't think the literature supports it. And then thyroid cancer is also a rumor. It's not true, but thyroid tumors do seem to be a thing. And there is a black box warning, which is the highest level of warning on the Ozempic and Wegovy packages for thyroid issues. You shouldn't take the drugs if you have a history of certain kinds of thyroid tumors in your family. But a lot of the experts that I know are sort of saying, the side effects are trumped up. Some other experts, because of the intestinal blockage, are saying, no, these drugs are really dangerous. And so in terms of whether they're risky, I think, you got to just sort of assess risk, right? I mean, getting in a car is risky. Like what level of risk are you comfortable with? There's no long-term side effect data on semaglutide or tirzepatide. There's some long-term side effect data on another, like a first cousin GLP-1 drug that goes out 8 years. And, it appears mostly safe, but nobody's looking at like, what really is happening to the digestive system as you just slow it down.
The other thing is if you're slowing digestion down, all of that food and stuff is sitting in your gut, and leaving things in your gut is not healthy for the body.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of unclear like how good this is for the body in general, for nutritional absorption, for digestion. Like we just, and this is the kind of thing that's never studied with drugs, right? It really is a buyer beware situation. Nobody, the people who have the money to fund the studies or the pharma companies, they're not studying the long-term health impact of their drugs. They're not. And nobody else is either. So we just aren't going to know, really.
Right. And I think one of the fascinating things here is that although these drugs are mimicking molecules that are naturally created by the body, they're functioning in a very non-physiologic way. So for example, they last in the body much longer than they would naturally. So naturally we eat a meal, let's say GLP-1 is produced, we feel satiated, we stop eating, but then the GLP-1 concentration goes down and we feel hungry again and we're ready to eat again. And this is the natural cycle. Whereas these drugs, which we know are used once a week, right? So they're actually in your system essentially to some extent the whole week. And that's just one demonstration of how differently they're operating than they would in the absence of the drug. So just naturally. I think I had a slightly different read on the body composition. It's interesting because this has been so debated. And like you said, I completely agree. I think when you lose weight, there is an inevitable loss of muscle. That's pretty much unavoidable. And the number I've seen for that is about 25%. So of the total weight you lose, about 25% would be muscle in the most optimal situation, which of course it's not always easy to create the optimal situation. In the studies, and to your point, they really have not studied body composition well for these drugs. That's like the overarching thing. There were two kind of subsets of people that were studied as part of these two larger trials. And those each enrolled about 140, I think, to 170 people. And I think these are probably the studies that you were referring to. And they showed that of the total weight lost, about 40% was muscle and 60% was fat, or I should say lean body mass versus fat. And so to your point, I agree with you. I think in the end, the overall body composition of the participants was slightly improved from where they started. And that's something that's not being discussed, and it probably should be, which I think is the point that you're making. The other side of it, though, from my perspective, is that we're still losing much more lean muscle than would be ideal on these drugs. So that ratio is still not ideal. And also, if we kind of move out from percentages and just look at total lean mass, there's so much evidence showing that someone's total lean muscle mass is so linked to so many aspects of health, including longevity. And this is why, for example, strength training, protein intake, all of that stuff is being pushed so hard, especially as people get older, but really at every age. And so when we see people who have been on these drugs, their total muscle mass is less than it was when they started. And the reason that I think this is notable is because if and when they decide to come off of those drugs, their starting point now is much less lean muscle than it was before they started the drugs, which is to say there's less of those metabolic engines to help them maintain their weight, to help them burn the energy from the food that they are eating. And that amount of loss is potentially less than they would have had they followed a strategy where the weight loss was slower or more regulated. That said, I mean, I think there's just so much we don't know, right? Like, what if we pair these drugs with a strength program, with a protein program? What if we do these drugs in a much more gradual way? What if there's new generations of the drug that are more gradual? So I think there's a lot of exploration still, but there are some parts of the studies that raise flags for me.
Well, and the other thing that I'm just thinking about while you guys are talking is like, if a person goes on these drugs, a lot of times they're on it for life, right? Because they're not necessarily making the changes, like you said, adding strength training. Stephanie mentioned, making sure you're eating a nutrient-dense diet. Like if you're not making any of those changes and you're just going to Chick-fil-A and eating the kids' meal and not lifting weights and doing all the work, then, where does that leave you? Like skinny fat, basically.
That's, I think, to my mind, tied with the number one issue. I think there's two mega issues with these drugs. One is you have to stay on them forever. If you're doing it for weight loss, you have to stay on them forever. So there was a very large trial that took a bunch of people from semaglutides, got them off semaglutides, and 2/3 of the weight was regained just within the first year. So these are drugs that only continue to work while you're on them, which is disappointing, right? Because if you've lost weight, you might think, well, surely my brain will adjust and allow me to continue to maintain that lower body weight once I get off the drugs. And no, it does not. The brain remembers what you used to weigh and it forces you back up there. Just as if you lost the weight on a diet. I mean, that's what happens with dieting also, right? So that is disconcerting. The other big issue is the cost, right? And so when you're looking at being on these drugs for life, we got a lot of years before that patent on semaglutide expires. And these drugs are costing over $1,000 a month, over $1,000 a month. And so the people that I know who are on these drugs, they're starting to ask themselves the question, how can I get off this? And what do I do now? They feel very trapped.
Yes. And in addition to the personal cost, which is a huge issue, there's also the kind of system level cost. So even in a scenario where, let's say, your insurance is covering it, which is fantastic on an individual level from a budget standpoint, but ultimately the drug is still being purchased somehow. And so when we think about how to create health for as many people as possible, financial sustainability does come into the picture. And some of the stats around essentially if most of the people who currently qualify for these drugs were on them, the total healthcare expenditure for that at the current price points, and maybe the price points will change, but to your point, there's so many dynamics in the pharma industry that impact price point beyond the collective good, that essentially the total amount of money required to pay for these drugs for all of us is just it's almost like impossible.
It's in the trillions with a T.
Right. It's in the trillions. And like even now I saw a statistic that essentially if everyone in Medicare who qualified were on these drugs at the current price point, it would cost almost double the amount of the total amount of money being spent for all drugs for all people on Medicare right now.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So, and I don't know that that's exact, but that's just an idea of order of magnitude where we're not in a situation where we can just keep going on the path we're going and end up in a new place of collective sustainability.
Yeah, the money is so huge. I mean, Novo Nordisk, which makes Ozempic and Wegovy, now has a market capitalization of $425 billion, which, oh, by the way, is larger than the company it's located in. It's more money than the entire GDP of Denmark.
Yeah, which is insane when you think about that.
Yeah, it's the most valuable company in all of Europe now, just in the last couple of years, thanks to Ozempic and Wegovy. Like they're really raking it in.
The other reason why this is so important, I think that the dollars piece of it is because, to your point, these pharma companies are so cash rich that they actually have a huge role in shaping the narrative around these drugs. Like, I don't think that often that we realize how impactful pharma dollars are on even our own education around these drugs. So like one example is people have probably seen, and we might talk about this, one of the big studies demonstrating a reduced risk of cardiovascular events on these drugs. For example, that study was funded by Novo Nordisk. So, right.
They all are. All the studies on them. Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, that makes you question them. At least it makes
Right.
me question them right off the bat then. Like,
Well, and that's just the beginning. And the reality is pharma as an industry is funding so many aspects of our lives that we don't even realize day to day. So this is not a new thing, unfortunately. But there's so many manifestations of this. For example, I saw that Reuters had done an investigation, and they looked at the people, the researchers, physicians, authors who were credited with crafting 5 prominent sets of obesity treatment guidelines for doctors. 50% of those people had accepted payments from companies that were selling or developing obesity drugs. So this is baked in to all the information that we're getting. You see experts coming on CNN, on Good Morning America, on various news outlets, and they're kind of framed as neutral experts, and they're also on payroll for pharma companies. And that's not to say that they're not neutral. It's just to say that there are a lot of layers in terms of the information that we're receiving. And I think we all just need to be aware that we have to really be our own investigators and really be attentive to understanding the information ourselves as well.
I think that's great advice.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like when you get a prescription for one of these drugs, you also need to be given a prescription to someone, a healthcare professional who can help you make these lifestyle changes that needs to go hand in hand. Instead of just this quick fix.
Yeah. And that's a big thing that's not being discussed enough. Although, interestingly, the drugs are approved for use in addition to a lifestyle treatment, like, you know, a healthy diet and moderate exercise or whatever, you know, but it's not really being done. They're being taken as a solution in and of themselves, a quick fix. But note that, you know, semaglutide produces a 15% weight loss, and that's maintained at year 1, year 2. It's got actually relatively meager initial weight loss, and I assume that's because the dosing typically starts low and ramps up. That's how most experts find that they can circumvent those gastrointestinal side effects, the nausea, the vomiting, and so forth. People start on a very low dose and take quite a while to ramp up. So the first initial weight loss in the first 2 months, 3 months is not that impressive. You'd do just as well going to Weight Watchers or whatever. But at a year, 15% is whopping. I mean, that's way more than you get with any other program other than Brightline Eating, which full disclosure, that's my program. And we just published some data showing that actually Brightline Eating has identical results at 1 year and 2 years as semaglutide. So we're producing that just behaviorally, just with pretty intense and dramatic behavioral interventions. Like, we're very prescriptive about telling people what exactly to eat and what not to eat. But what's interesting is that 15% is not that much, actually. Like, if you're 300 pounds, you don't just want to lose 45 pounds, right? You want to lose way more than that. You want to lose probably 150 pounds, right? And in order for most people to get, like when I was obese, and then I lost all my excess weight, I lost 46% of my body weight, right? That's what it took for me to go from obese to slender. So 15% is kind of like, if you're really living with obesity, right? And so to achieve the results that most people are looking for, oh, by the way, and they want to be healthy too, I presume, right? It's going to take a massive combination of maybe a semaglutide drug or a GLP-1 drug, and then also, maybe stopping eating sugar and, ultra processed foods, maybe starting a good exercise regimen. It's going to take a combination of things.
Well, and that makes me wonder, like, what is the place for these drugs in our society, right? Like, if you're morbidly obese and you have all these other health factors that you're walking around like a ticking time bomb, maybe just going on the drug and losing the weight immediately is the best case scenario. I don't know. Or if you have diabetes and it's helping you level out your blood sugar levels and whatever, or you're the person on TikTok that's watching these videos and you want to lose 10 pounds and you're ordering the drug off some random site. Like, there's all these different scenarios out there, right? That people are kind of glomming onto. And, when is it okay? Is it ever okay? Like, that's kind of what I'm struggle with.
I've got a thought on that. I mean, I help people tackle this food addiction issue, for a living, this weight loss food addiction juggernaut. And it is hard. Addiction is a beast. I used to be addicted to crack cocaine and crystal meth, and food is harder. It is harder. It's harder because it's in your face all day, every day. People are pushing it on you. You can't get through a day without being triggered all day long to relapse, right? And if someone has decided that they really want to turn their life around and they need support, I think these drugs can provide a very helpful respite for the brain. If the person uses that period of time, I would say a year or so, to take the free gift of sort of quieting down the intense frenzy of addiction in the brain. Because as soon as someone tries to do something like stop eating sugar, right, the cue reactivity goes off the hook in the brain, and every billboard lights up for them brighter, and every logo sign looks more compelling, and it's maddening, right? And these drugs will calm that down a bit. And if you use that time to build in automatic habits really rigorously, I think that can be the appropriate use of these drugs. My estimation is that very, very, very few people will use the drugs that way, because really people are looking for, a free pass, for it just to be easier. And no harm, no foul. Life is hard. People are busy, right? There's we've all got a lot of things on our to-do list other than this, right? So, but I think that's my assessment of when and how these drugs make a lot of sense. You got to be going into it thinking, how am I going to get off this? And what am I going to be doing in the meantime so that, I'm set up for success, not just, otherwise it's just another diet. I mean, Oprah went on these drugs and then went off them for Thanksgiving so she could enjoy her food, right?
Yeah,
I guess I want to say no judgment, but I guess I do have some judgment about that. I mean, not really. I have a lot of compassion about it, but yeah, I think that people need to think deeply about, how am I using this as a tool?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think this is actually where some of these celebrity I don't know if we can call them spokespeople, but they're essentially de facto spokespeople now, right? Posting on Instagram, showing themselves in gorgeous dresses, showing themselves. It is such an opportunity for them to also show their blood testing and how they're improving other aspects of life, show their workouts, show the food changes they're having, talk about what the experience has been like, talk about their fears, talk about the benefits, right? Like to really bring voice to this experience, because I think there's a lot of glorification right now. It's kind of interesting because there's this dual stigma, but also glorification of these drugs. And there's also this interplay where right now they're primarily used by people who are wealthy and have access for the out-of-pocket payments, right? Like this is not an equal opportunity drug right now. And so I think that there's an opportunity not to put pressure on people in media, but really just to say like they are actually having a massive impact on people's decision-making, on their own views of their body, on their views of their kind of autonomy to lose weight with or without the drugs, right? Like this is having such amazing and kind of like shocking ripple effects right now. And I'd actually be really interested, Susan. I mean, I would imagine that this has become part of the conversation in your work. And to the extent that your work, it seems probably in the past has not been drug-based and is not now, right? That this is like such a mindset shift for the entire world, really, but certainly this small pocket of people who have access to these drugs.
Yeah, well, in my community, it's interesting. We're starting to get people who are on them or who have tried them. We're starting to get people, and to be honest, we're thinking about marketing to the population of people who are on them and now realizing, oh, wait, I don't want to spend $1,000 a month on this. You know, yes, I've lost some weight, but again, the weight loss is not stupendous. It's some. You know, and then the thought of like, cha-ching, $1,000 a month, people are like, oh, I want to get off this actually. So we do have people talking about it. I think mostly though, we're not in my community because most of the people in my community feel like they have a solution in Brightline Eating, and Brightline Eating produces the same level of decreased hunger and decreased cravings that you get on semaglutide drugs. We do it by stopping eating the addictive foods and letting the brain heal naturally. And oh, by the way, how we teach people to eat actually releases GLP-1 in much greater amounts. You've got to chew a lot and you got to eat a lot more fiber in order to do that, which means no ultra processed foods, which are made to be soft and not need to be chewed much, right? Mastication produces GLP-1. And so does an abundance of fiber, which means, you know, shocker, eating a lot of vegetables and things like that. So people are getting the results that they need from Brightline Eating, but not everybody. Addiction is a beast and relapse is rampant in any recovery program. And I bet there are people who are thinking, maybe I just need to use a GLP-1 drug to help me work my Brightline Eating program more. People in cycles of chronic relapse and things like that. And again, I'd be supportive of that. I think that's an appropriate use of the drug if they've got a program that they're going to try to dial in the meantime. So I guess my short answer to your question is I'm starting to hear the conversation, but not as much as you might think. I think a lot of people in my community are pretty anti-drug across the board. We've sourced a lot of our folks from the plant-based community. Brightline Eating is not a plant-based program, but the Food Revolution Network was a very big supporter of our work early on. And they're plant-based and also very just sort of, you know, pro-healthy lifestyle, anti, you know, taking a pill to fix it kind of orientation. So a lot of people in our community are just super biased, like knee-jerk against it. And I'm probably among the more moderately minded people of like, I could see why people would want that. I mean, I've just suffered with my food and my weight enough to go, oh, I get it. I understand why people would be like, yes, I need some help with this. Like why Oprah is on it. Like, I get it. Why she feels like this is a lifesaver, you know, really.
Yeah. Well, your work sounds fantastic, and I can't wait to learn more about it. Because talk about kind of recreating pathways that you actually can sustain your whole life. I think that's really what we're all searching for. And it's interesting because when we think about what you're saying, which is like basically, is there an exit ramp? And if there is it combined with a program like yours? What is the tool? But if we're not ever going to come off of them, then some of these side effects that may actually be quite minor in the short term begin to have cumulative effects, and we really don't know what those are. And I think, right, like this underlines the fact that we're just scratching the surface of our understanding of the science of metabolic regulation from a physiologic standpoint. So when we have drugs that essentially override our natural processes, it's not surprising that there might be kind of widespread impacts on the body and unexpected. And I think this is part of the reason why our track record for weight loss pills, diet pills, that kind of thing has been very challenged, right? Like there have been so many products that have come on the market.
Frankly,
yeah,
abysmal.
It's 0% success at this point. And you know, and like just one example is I heard, I don't know if people follow Peter Attia. He's kind of one of these pseudo celebrity health optimizers, but tends to be very rigorous about the research. And he's found in his patients that people on these drugs have actually had an increase in their resting heart rate. I think he said of 10 to 15 beats per minute. What does this mean? We don't really know, right? We know that in general, lower resting heart rate is linked to better health outcomes and better longevity and a whole bunch of other physiologic markers. But what is the impact of an increased resting heart rate over 1 year versus 50 years, right? And I think these are the kinds of questions that we just don't know the answer to. And this is why I probably bias towards, or I do bias towards a program like yours, Susan, where we're actually training our own bodies, and correct me if I'm not depicting your program correctly, but retraining our brains and our bodies to find true fundamental health with the pillars of health that we know kind of create a foundation for long-term health. Yeah.
Great points, Lauren. And let's go back now to the cardiovascular issue, because I think that heart rate thing is fascinating and eerie, right? It's a little like, so there's this big study funded by Novo Nordisk, which is fine, right? I trust the research that they're doing to a point, although as a research scientist myself, I definitely have experience. Like for my graduate thesis, my doctoral thesis, I had to run the experiment more than once to get it to work, right? So what does that mean, right? Like basically I couldn't replicate my own study. Like I ran it the first 2 times, it didn't work. The third time I got a result, and that's the one I published, right? This is rampant. It happens all the time. So anyway, so they ran this study, and it was people who were not diabetic. So they had no diabetes, but they had heart disease, and they went on semaglutide. There was a control group, but you know what there wasn't? Was a third group of people who lost a comparable amount of weight who weren't on the drug. So what they showed was being on semaglutide reduced the number of heart events, right? Strokes, heart attacks, things like that, by 20%, which is not trivial. And science touts semaglutide drugs and GLP-1 agonists as the breakthrough of the year for 2023, not just because of the weight loss effects, but because of the health benefits. And I'm sort of thinking, were there any health benefits there other than helping people lose weight, right? Because when you lose weight, almost everything gets better. It's like, you know, just kind of across the board, things get better when you lose weight. And so that's the thing I'm curious about. Like, I don't actually think these drugs improve the heart at all.
It's just a natural consequence of the weight loss is what you're saying, which you can do through other means, including, like you said, eating more fiber and chewing your food, which doesn't cost very little in the whole scheme of this, right?
You know, yes, but weight loss is a beast. I mean, that's why these drugs are so popular, is that it's not easy to take off weight and keep it off. I mean, in Brightline Eating, we do it. But what we do is such a lifestyle overhaul, and people have to be really, really committed to going all in with it. And for the people who are, it works amazingly well, and they lose all the weight that they want to lose. And it's incredible. But in this society, it's not easy. Like, you have to kind of buy into a whole different way of structuring your day, living your life, you know, dealing with food, packing your food when you travel often, ordering really differently in a restaurant. It's a big deal. It doesn't just happen that you just kind of decide to lose weight and you do it.
No, and let's face it, for most
don't want to put in the work. Like, at the end of the day, they just don't, right?
Well, not only that, we haven't made it, like we started this conversation, our society and the food industry has made it extremely difficult for people to make good choices. So for the average person who cannot afford this very expensive drug that they would have to potentially be on for life, their environment, their surroundings are such that eating ultra processed food is kind of their only option right now. So until we change that landscape, we're not really going to be able to solve this metabolic health crisis and diabetes, because we're not allowing people to eat as their bodies need, eat what we all should be eating in order to live healthier lives, which is a whole nother, separate conversation, but just to paint that picture, that's part of the challenge here for most people that are suffering from obesity and other chronic
and we
health
have
conditions.
to speak a word. We have to speak a word for the people for whom it's literally the only option, right? People living in food deserts. Socioeconomic status plays in huge here.
Right.
And, I know where I live in Rochester, New York, it's one of these cities in the Northeast where you've got incredible disparities just among people living 10 miles apart from each other. And we do have regions where there is no Wegmans grocery store where they sell all the produce and so forth. There's none,
My favorite grocery store growing up, Susan, because I'm from Rochester, New York. And there's a thing, if you say you're from Rochester, New York as a sidebar, you immediately talk about Wegmans. It's the most random fun fact, right?
We take our tourists to Wegmans. You got to see our grocery store.
That's great. Well, and just building on this, I mean, we have an entire food policy system that actively is contributing to causing disease, right? Like we have major subsidized foods in our agricultural system, like corn, soybeans, right? That are actively then fueled, going into processed foods, right? At reduced costs. Like this is a problem that is so much greater than any one person deciding to eat Dunkin' Donuts for breakfast. I think it can't be overstated how much we are set up to fail right now. And I think one of my questions around the expense of these drugs actually goes back to that, which is what opportunity cost is there to putting all this money into this drug solution versus, let's say, to reforming our food system,
our farm bill,
right?
Which would be amazing, right?
Exactly.
Like why aren't we all getting together and doing that?
Because no one's going to make a lot of money.
Yeah. Right. And imagine we took $1 trillion and we devoted it to research, advocacy, right? Like changing food deserts, all these things. And yet it's also not as easy as just saying, okay, all the processed food companies need to go away, because actually those processed food companies are also core players in our overall economic system, right? Like they actually impact all of us. They're involved with a lot of the kind of government-led systems that create the foundation of even our own kind of financial picture as individuals, whether that's through pensions, through other things. And so it's really complex. And I guess the question in my mind is, what if we took all of this resourcing and we really devoted our intellect and our energy and our focus towards forcing ourselves to kind of heal some of this underlying dysfunction? I don't know if that's a possibility in our future, but I certainly think that the more that we lean on drug solutions, probably the less likely it is that we will lean into those other areas. Not that they can't both be done, but it's just the reality of resourcing.
I agree with you completely on that. And I would love to see all of the people that believe that collectively trying to help make some of these changes, because if we all just talk about it and nobody has any action, like where are we going?
Right. And it's not just food, it's everything. Right. It's jobs where we commute 2 hours, we get paid very little, we're working 10 hours a day, right? Like people have multiple kids, they're not able, like if you don't have a system in place to get good sleep, to have ways to reduce your stress, all of these things that are so built into American society, these all contribute to metabolic dysfunction. These all contribute to environments for failure. These all contribute to addiction. And I guess it's just, to me, it's like, at what point do we pause and say, what do we want our country to look like 100 years from now? And that to me is like the opportunity point that we're at. And maybe the answer is partially drugs, but it's hard for me to believe that the entire answer is drugs.
Totally. Our whole system needs a complete overhaul. And I think actually, if I had to say, the point of entry to making that happen would be to maybe eliminate or severely curtail financial contributions to political people, to politicians. Because what happens is politicians get to the White House, and we saw this a couple decades ago. Politicians arrive at the White House intent on changing the Farm Bill. So if people don't know, the Farm Bill started in 1973. Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture, looked around and said, why aren't we growing more food? We need to grow more food. We need to subsidize the production of food. Just all bets are grow. Let's go, everybody. Grow, grow, grow. And he started paying farmers to grow more food, and genetically modified food and big agribusiness started taking off. And a lot of the crops that are grown today would not make a profit without the subsidies that are coming from the federal government. Like, they wouldn't be able to pay their employees. And so you've got all these states in the middle of the United States where the economy would really tank if the Farm Bill got substantially modified, right? And so there are huge financial consequences and be hugely unpopular for a while, right? Would it sort out? It would, right? Companies fold, and then new ones, would come up in their stead who are growing strawberries according to the crop rotation guidelines that were now in place. Like, it would happen, but it would be incredibly painful for a lot of states and a lot of people. And Michelle Obama came into the White House trying to get, childhood obesity on the radar. And within a few months, she was talking about let's move, right? Why? Because Coke was financing her husband's presidential reelection bid, right? And suddenly talking about childhood obesity wasn't on the ticket anymore. It was talking about getting kids moving, which is a big, softer pill to swallow if you're Coca-Cola, right? So we're going to need to change fundamental things about the way this country works. But Lauren, I just couldn't agree more that we need to be mindful that even if we're getting these drugs paid by insurance, that cost is being absorbed by the pools, right, that those insurers are paying for. I mean, I own a company, Brightline Eating. We pay for 100% of our employees' health care. So every copay, every Band-Aid, every premium, every dollar spent, the sixth pair of glasses, the second pair of hearing aids, we pay for all of it. And the cost that we're absorbing on that is upwards of 20% a year. Like, it's skyrocketing. So people on my team think, hey, I haven't gotten a raise in a few years. It's like, well, you have, actually. It's just that I'm still paying for your healthcare, right? And if we want to talk about what these drugs are likely to do to those, even if you live in Europe, and it's the country of Sweden that's now paying for it, right? That money is getting absorbed through the tax dollars. How much do you already think you pay for taxes in Sweden? Well, it's going to go up because everybody wants to be on a semaglutide drug, right? And we need to be super mindful of that.
Right. And these are drugs for life, probably. That's the other thing, right? This is not a $16,000 per year expense for 1 year. This is, which, if we're going to compare it to other kind of other drastic weight loss strategies, for example, bariatric surgery, right? That's expensive. It's a one-time cost. And that's a whole nother conversation, kind of other modalities. But the expense over even an employee's entire career is just extremely high. And it's interesting because I think when we think about, even on a personal level, $1,300 a month going towards your health, you could spend it on that drug, but what are other things that you would do for your health if you gave yourself a budget of $1,300?
I mean,
like, would you have
when
someone...
I think about that, it's unbelievable.
Get a sauna.
All the things
Right.
I could
You
do
would...
for $1,300 a month.
Right. Like, you could hire someone to help you prepare your meals every Sunday. You could hire a personal trainer to force you out of bed at 6 a.m, right? Like, there are things you could do, and I'm not saying that those would be as effective, right? Like, to your point, Susan, it's hard. It doesn't matter if someone's like pushing you out of bed. It's hard. It's hard for everybody. But I just think it's an interesting perspective to think about. If we've now said that we're willing to pay up to $1,300 a month for our health, what are other ways that we might use those dollars, and how might those kind of propel us into a better experience of being alive for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Because I think the other piece of this is that many of us, and I've been at chapters in my life when this is true of me, have normalized just feeling kind of crappy every single day, right? Like, we wake up in the morning, we're exhausted, we're tanking all day, we're like barely, that's normal. And we've accepted that as a normal part of life. And I think part of this also is when people get a taste of what it feels like to not be in that, that is so powerful. And it's like, how do we get more people to have that taste? How do we get more people to see that it's possible not to crash after every meal, right? That it's possible to sleep through the night without a drug, that kind of thing.
Mm.
So much to think about.
Yes.
My mind is just spinning. Like coming into this conversation, I didn't even really think about the financial piece of it the way you're describing it. And yeah.
Well,
a
and it's
lot.
interesting because those people that are spending the $1,300 or $1,000 a month, I bet before they went on the drug, they weren't sitting there figuring out how could I spend $1,000 on all these other health benefits, but now they're doing it.
Right.
And so, oh gosh, I mean, there's so much more for people to understand about this drug and, giving them like another prescription, like we said earlier,
It's not a
for
quick
these
decision.
lifestyle. No.
You really need to put a lot of thought and care into determining if you are a good fit for this drug and how you're going to proceed. And like one of you mentioned earlier, what is your plan to get off the drug so that you can maintain, the weight loss if you choose to go on it?
It's something I hadn't thought about until this conversation from a financial perspective. But Lauren, you're really brilliant sort of laying out the landscape of the finances leads me to this conclusion, which is separate from the metabolic crisis. We've also got this financial crisis, right? Where the extremes of wealth and poverty are getting worse. Right. And this drug actually is an active and incredibly potent mechanism that's doing that. It's contributing to that. It's taking money from people who, because they so want to lose weight, are willing to pay this exorbitant amount, and it's funneling it straight into big pharma, which is now creating billionaires at a rate that, we haven't seen before. And it's siphoning money out of, the middle class population and putting it straight up to the ultra rich. And so it's just another thought of like, this is a pipeline that's exacerbating that fundamental disparity.
Right. And the conversation, at least that I've been hearing mostly, even just among peers, is much more around, and I don't know if we would call it vanity, but essentially vanity. Like, I want to look a certain way in a certain amount of time. I've heard much less conversation outside of academic and research communities around health. Like, I went to the doctor and I found out that I have fatty liver disease. And I'm only 35, and that doesn't work for me. So now I'm exploring options about how to best tackle that problem. One of the options I've seen is this drug. For example, that kind of logic and conversation I haven't heard as much. What I've mostly heard is, did you see, XYZ celebrity? I don't want to target anyone's celebrity, right? But like, I've never seen them look so amazing. I mean, it's just incredible. Like, it's that kind of conversation. And I think it also misses the bigger picture, which is that someone who is living with a high level of obesity and their life is at risk is not the same as someone who wants to lose 15 pounds. I'm not necessarily that convinced that for someone who just wants to lose 15 pounds, that this drug will improve their underlying health, right? Like all the markers of health. Does it improve their lean muscle mass? Does it improve their aerobic capacity? Does it improve the nutrition that they're feeding to their brain, to their body, to their hormonal balance? I'm not convinced that this drug is a tool for that. But there are people where I think this drug is a true, potentially life-saving tool. But those are not the same groups of people. And that is just being totally glossed over. And if anything, this drug is being kind of depicted by celebrities and others as a miracle drug for every person, for every use.
Yes.
So there's another point that I want to make here, which is that this drug has revealed something about what I think has been underlying all along, which is that the trends of the way people think about weight loss were going in the direction of wanting to lose weight is on the outs. Big mannequins are in. Health at every size is in. Body positivity is in. If you're dieting, you're an idiot. And suddenly, everyone hears about Ozempic and Wegovy, and it's like, oh, everyone actually does want to lose weight. Right? And it's just, it feels like the covers have been pulled off.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, actually, people want to fit into size 6 jeans. Like that's what's actually going on here. And I think it's really interesting. I think that there's a body positivity and fat acceptance movement conversation that could be had here. And I think that that's a very nuanced conversation as well, right? We don't we don't often have that in the most skillful way. The reality that we really need to work on our anti-fat bias as a society. It's, I think, the most rampant prejudice and stereotyping that exists in our society, and the most harmful that exists. And, you know, anti-Black bias is way on the outs, but anti-fat bias is still right in front of our faces and, you know, hiding in plain sight. And at the same time, I think that normalizing and accepting a world in which our collective body mass keeps going up with no holds barred is terrible. And it's the food situation that we're not squaring our shoulders to. And just like we've been talking about, like, what are we doing about our ultra processed food environment? That's the issue. And it's not that fat people are to blame. It's that we have normalized a food culture that in people with certain epigenetic predispositions, you know, they're going to put on weight as a runaway train. And what are we doing about that as a society?
Right. And even beyond weight, like I don't think I mentioned this in the intro, but when I was in my mid-20s, I was diagnosed with prediabetes. And that was within the context of having had a thin BMI, being an avid runner, all of these things. But I was fueling my body with sugar. I didn't see it that way at the time. That's how I see it now, right? But I was eating cereal at breakfast and all these things that we now know are not fueling a healthy body. And so to your point, we're in a food environment that's a setup for failure, even if you're not manifesting it as weight. Maybe you're manifesting it as cognitive cloudiness. Maybe you're manifesting it as anxiety and depression. Maybe you're right? And a lot of people are manifesting it as multiple of these things at the same time. And I think this is where we always come back to the same thing, which is the reality that as a country, we're very sick. And if we don't fundamentally change what we're doing, that's going to continue. And obviously the solution to this is way outside of the amount of time we have in this conversation. But I do think you're completely right, Susan, which is Ozempic and related drugs are really an important forcing function for us to have honest conversations about what is actually happening. Because to your point, this is a phenomena that's undeniable, right? Like we now know, like our behavior is telling us the true story. Around what's actually happening behind the scenes. And I think we can use this as an opportunity to reset and to have some honest conversations about what actually people need and want.
And you guys both did such a great job today, like peeling back these layers and not just addressing the surface of weight loss and, oh, it's a quick fix. And so this conversation can continue to unfold. And I just thank you so much for all of your insight that you've shared today. I feel like we could keep talking for another hour, but
I would just ask, you know, as a quick wrap up, what would you each suggest our listeners, like, let's say we have some listeners that are considering these drugs, like what would be the number one thing you would suggest they go out and do or ask their doctor as they're considering their course of action?
I'm going to be so self-serving in this, but not intentionally. But what I would say is go read the book, Bright Line Eating, because what it'll do is it'll give you a clear understanding of what the behavioral equivalent of these drugs is, right? Like this is what you have to do in order to achieve what this drug will do pharmacologically. And if you're not willing to do something like that, you're going to either have to stay on this drug for the rest of your life or do none of it and accept what you've got right now, right? Like those are your options. I want you to have a clear sort of there's this, there's that, or there's that, right? I can take a drug, I can do it all behaviorally, or I can stay where I am. Or I can take a drug as a segue to a behavioral lifestyle change. But if you're not willing to pony up the effort in your life to do it behaviorally, that means you're going to have to stay on the drug for life. And no judgment if that's what you choose to do, but it's accepting risk of potential side effects and a heck of a lot of money, right? And if that's how you want to spend your money, then go to it, right? But I think Lauren's made some excellent points. You could give yourself a budget and spend that money in a lot of other ways, right? To improve your health, right? So I just want people to have a sense behaviorally of what the trade-offs are.
This one is hard to answer. I think what comes to mind for me is visualize yourself waking up in 5 years. What do you want to feel? And what do you want that day to feel like? Are you taking a drug? Are you Like, have you completely changed your entire, what's in your kitchen? Have you followed a program like Susan's, right? Like, have you rewired your brain? But when you wake up on that morning 5 years from now, what is your life like? Because I think that's really the question, that part of the decision that you're making when you start these drugs, at least to what we know now. And I do think that, like, I feel very humbled around the fact that we just do not know the answers yet. And I think we have enough to know that I completely agree with what you said, Susan. Like, we have enough to know that there's probably two primary decisions. Like, there's one big decision ahead of you, and that's the route that you're going to take to make this change. But I think it also just depends on your comfort level with uncertainty. For me, I think we know with almost absolute certainty that if you are able to achieve these pillars of metabolic health, that you will be healthier at very little risk. That to me is what we know. I think all these other tools, and certainly these drugs, fall into the category of the unknown right now.
You guys brought up such good points, and think it really questions for people to be asking themselves, and things to consider in advance of deciding whether to go on one of these drugs.
Yeah.
We so appreciate you guys' time and your thoughtful conversation. I mean, that's what we need. We need more thoughtful conversation around these topics.
Yes.
Agreed. Thank you for providing the forum for us to have this conversation today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And both have a great day. And who knows, we could have you back on again in another year or two at some point, talking more about this as it unfolds. So
it's going to be interesting.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.